Well, hello, this is Nihar Chhaya. I'm a Fortune 50 executive coach, and I'm hosting my LinkedIn Live series with my friend Dr. Stefanie K. Johnson today. Stefanie, thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me, Nihar.
So today we're actually going to get into a lot of good discussion around Stefanie's work. So Stefanie is a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder at the Leeds Business School. She's also the author of the Wall Street Journal bestseller, Inclusify. Also happens to be on the Thinkers 50 radar this year, the radar class of 2020. And she happens to be a fellow MG 100, Marshall Goldsmith 100 coaches member of our community. And I'm so happy to have her with me here. We are looking forward to having a pretty good audience turnout here. We recognize, Stefanie and I talked about why we wanted to connect on LinkedIn Live was particularly because not just her book success recently, but also the relevance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is her focus area with today's news and what we're going through this year. So Stefanie, let's actually jump right in. I wanted to actually ask you a little bit about your work with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I try to think about it from the framework of my work as an executive coach with global companies, where we look at the employee life cycle from recruiting and hiring to engaging and developing people and teams to actually advancing and promoting them to senior leadership positions. And so I thought we might kind of break it down into that kind of format, because I know you've done a lot of work with really transforming hiring practices as well as practices in developing people. Why don't we look at the recruiting and hiring work you've done? I was actually fascinated to learn about some of the work you've done that has actually had a big impact on groups like the NFL, to NASA. And can you share a little bit about some of your work in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love your framework of looking at the entire picture, because I think that's how we really create change, is considering all of the kinks in the pipeline that are going to stop equality. So for recruiting and hiring, I feel like the very easy first step is recruiting a diverse slate of women and people of color and women of color to interview for a job. And if you don't do that, then you're probably not going to hire a person of color or a woman of color if you didn't even get them into the interview stage. And I think that just that small step can have a huge impact. One of the studies we did showed that having a diverse slate of candidates increased your chance of hiring a woman or a person of color by 70 times, like 70 times greater. And wow, we're adding one more person to a finalist slate, and it has like just a much, much larger effect.
Mm-hmm.
So if you get there, so now you've recruited a very diverse slate of finalists, then I think it's about creating selection procedures that are transparent and fair. In one study, I think we'll chat about, we did dual anonymization. So we took the names off of applications and we saw that decreased bias against women. But even if you don't go that far, there's still ways to just really simply, I call it the DCBA principle rather than ABC, which is define criteria before assessing. Because I think usually when you interview someone, you interview them and then you back judge all the reasons why that person's the ideal candidate, right, to kind of fit your preconceived notions of who you want to hire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. So you are trying to challenge people's unconscious biases, I guess, when they come across resumes or different parts of that process.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that especially the blinding, or I think it's a bit of an ableist term, so I like to say anonymization, but anonymization has a huge impact on people's state of mind, because a lot of people think they are being totally fair and non-biased in their judgments. But when you see a switch from non-anonymized to anonymized increases diversity, it really sheds some light on how you've been making decisions in the past.
Yeah, and so we talked about the NFL, the issue of actually hiring more diversity among coaches. And I think the anonymization that you're talking about was actually used at NASA as well. Yeah, so quite a bit of visibility into your work. So tell me a little bit about, the NFL process, the Rooney Rule. Maybe explain to our viewers a little bit about what that's about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not a big football person, so I would have never probably known about this, but there was a rule created to combat the fact that the majority of NFL players are Black men, but almost no coaches are Black men. So a rule was created that for every head coaching position, you have to interview one Black or African American, or maybe person of color for the job. And so then people have tracked this, whether it's worked. And really the answer is no, it hasn't worked at all. I think we're maybe at an all-time low when it comes to Black coaches. And so I did a research study on this where I looked back at all of the hires for head coaching positions in the NFL using publicly available data. So SportsCenter, Twitter, whatever I could find to look at who they actually interviewed for each position. And essentially every single time that a Black coach was hired, that team or the managers had interviewed 2 Black coaches rather than just the one required for the Rooney Rule. There's like one exception, that was Vance Joseph here in Colorado. As far as I could find, he was the only potential Black coach interviewed, but in the rest of Twitter history, there was always 2. And so in an interview for ESPN, I made this statement of why not just interview 2? Like this isn't a huge difference, and it could make all the difference. And so I think last month they just switched the Rooney Rule procedures to interview 2 Black coaches. Now, I don't know if it's because of me. I haven't had NFL. But.
Well, I'm sure you definitely had a big part in that. It is interesting how resistant we are to opening these processes to some things that actually look kind of commonsensical, right?
Absolutely. I think it's the status quo bias, right? And it's like, but this is how we've always done it. And we cannot change it because that's the way we do it. And the way you do something feels good and right because that's how you've done it. But with COVID, like status quo is gone, right? We redid everything, every aspect of business, or in my job teaching, or in your job coaching. It's all different and life goes on, right? Like we figured it out. And so I think that just shows how possible change is, especially as we're rebuilding the workplace.
Yes. Yeah, I want to talk about rebuilding the workplace. Actually, it's a great segue. Before we get into that, I want to just give a shout out to some of the people that have joined us. So I see Darren, my friend from Nashville, is on the line. Darren's actually an executive coach as well. Hey, Art, how are you? Alana is somebody I met. She's from Boulder as well. Rachel, my good friend from Dallas. Lisa Bricker from Boulder as well. Wow, you have a few folks from your town. Hey, people who have just tuned in, let us know where you tuned in from. Let us know what city you're from. But also feel free to type in the chat box your questions for Stefanie. Definitely going to get to them in this call. And also feel free to follow each of us. If you're not connected to Stefanie or me, you can open up a new browser and hit the follow button for each of our profiles. Hit the like and the share button so you can get some of your friends to join in as well. We have a good half hour here today. So Stefanie, let's talk about that rebuilding the workplace piece, because actually, your book came out recently, Inclusify. I loved it. I actually happened to really resonate with this idea that, I think you mentioned that there are 2 drivers here that people as humans have. We want to feel a sense of belonging, but we also want to feel a sense of being unique in our company. Tell me a little bit about how that kind of revelation came for you, and why you thought that it was really important to write that.
Yeah, so I started doing this research where, really the focus of the book is how leaders can actually create change using evidence-based practices. So it's a bunch of lessons of, you can use dual anonymization, or have a diverse slate, or have reciprocal mentoring programs. But when I was doing the interviews to understand what the practices were that worked, what really came out to me is that there were a few extremely common ways that leaders misstepped. And even those who were trying to create diversity and inclusion, they were like not quite getting it right. And so when I looked at these buckets, like I sort everyone into these buckets, it really came out that they were always lacking one of these 2 basic and essential human drives, which we know before Inclusify are related to the experience of inclusion. And so they're feeling like you belong. I think belonging was one of the biggest trends LinkedIn shared in 2019. We care about belonging, but it's not just belonging. Like creating a warm, fuzzy feeling for everyone. It's creating belonging where everyone can still be themselves. And I think that's the tricky part, because a lot of companies and a lot of leaders were good at creating belonging in a very homogenous group. But what they didn't see is that the people who didn't fit the mold actually had to cover or try to fit in a way that made them like still lack inclusion, I guess, is the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I can tell from my own personal experience. I am an American born, but to Indian immigrant parents. And so I was always straddling these culture differences between, for instance, Indian culture is one where you don't necessarily brag about yourself. You don't kind of raise your hand and say, look how great I am. You let your results speak for themselves, if you will. But of course, in American culture, it really is kind of every man for themselves, and there's a competitive kind of streak. And so I would struggle a lot of times with this idea that I want to fit in, I want to kind of keep my head under the radar, but I always felt a sense of, does anybody notice, what I'm bringing to the table? And I suspect that happens with so many different cultures beyond mine and races and genders.
Oh, absolutely. So similar to you, I'm a Mexican woman, although I think I enjoy or I experience a lot of white privilege because people are never, as far as I know, racist against me because I appear Caucasian, but people can definitely be sexist. And just like you, like I tried the fitting in, assimilating, keeping my views, especially like, so I'm a business professor, right? And I study leadership and diversity and inclusion and how these things intersect. But whenever I would talk about my research, even like on job interviews and stuff, I would only talk about the leadership part because I'm trying to like fit in, right? And the result is I'm leaving a big part of who I am and what I care about. And actually, it's probably my most interesting work. Just like kind of leaving it out to be accepted. And I think when that happens, you like, even if everyone's super nice to you, you always think like, okay, maybe they're nice to me because I'm trying to fit in with them. And if they really knew who I was, like they'd kick me to the curb. You'll never know the truth unless you let them see all of the whole self you are, and probably unless your leader encourages people to share that.
Yes, exactly right. And it reminds me a little bit about like your comment about how people may not have judged you differently based on your appearance. You talk a lot about this headwinds and tailwinds concept. And it really, I think, is such a relevant topic because of the need, I think, for a lot of people to, like, there's a lot of talk about how white privilege needs to be noticed among, people need to notice their white privilege. And that is obviously a very loaded term for many people, because clearly that's the whole point, is that there's a fragility, as Robin DiAngelo talks about, there's that white fragility around. I don't want to even admit that I might have something to do with this system. But you actually have approached it in a really, I think, a really palatable way, which is to say, it's not so much that I have to be like either I'm privileged or I'm not privileged. It's actually like we all have advantages and disadvantages in our story. Can you talk a little bit about the headwinds and tailwinds concept?
Yeah, this was really an idea that I stole from Dolly Chugg's book, The Person You Meant to Be. And it's the idea that we all have little things that have pushed us ahead and made life easier. So those are your tailwinds. Maybe it's your parents were able to pay for your college education, or you got this one internship because you happen to know this person. There's just like little things. For me, I said appearing white, I think, is something that was a tailwind for me. It helps me get a job. People are going to be less biased against me. And obviously, not everyone has those things that push them. And at the same time, people have things that hold them back. So the headwinds, those are things you have to overcome. So like for me, I grew up really poor. So I had to actually not just pay for my college, but get a job to pay for my college applications. And I think people who don't have that particular headwind don't necessarily recognize that, if you have two kids, two students, because I work in a university, and they both have an SAT score of 1400. This is a very good score. And one of those kids, had to work, take a job, take care of their siblings, all these things, and got a 1400. And the other kid took Princeton Review. Their parents paid for them to take the test multiple times, and they had every, the best education, the best schools, and they got a 1400. Which kid's smarter, right? Or what, which kid has the most merit? And I think it's really easy to say, well, I just care about merit. And that's another one of the simple ways that leaders went wrong, the meritocracy. If that one kid at 1410 with the 100-point bump that you get from Princeton Review, is that more meritorious? Like, I think in a lot of I guess in my circles, I think a lot of people would say, you take the kid with the 1410, like it's straight top-down selection.
Right.
And we do that. And I think that's why we have this huge gap, because it's not a level playing field from the start. And so the way we assess people, pretending that it's a meritocracy, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I was on LinkedIn the other day, and I saw somebody post this idea. There was some article about how the next Treasury Secretary should be an African American, and there was some justification about why. And of course, there was somebody commenting saying, "No, it's got to be the best person for the role. Who cares if it's a race issue or if they're a woman or a man?" And this is a retort that really bothers me. I think exactly to the point you just made, because there's no, I guess, awareness of, Martin Luther King had that quote where he says, it's a cruel jest to ask a bootless man to lift themselves up by their bootstraps, and it's like, you're not recognizing that there's a certain disadvantage that people have behind that story. And
one of my pet peeves too, that for the job. And one of the research studies that I did where I interviewed CEOs of corporate boards that had gender parity. So it's like, do they have women on the board? And in this case, parity was, if they had 3 women out of 10, like 30%, that's really good. Most organizations in the Fortune 500 have 1 or 2. And people kept saying this phrase of, well, at the end of the day, we want to choose the best person for the job, for board member. But there's like this huge research study done that showed that to get on a board for the first time, women have to have significantly greater experience than men. So do we choose the best person for the job? Like, it might feel like it, and we might know this person from another board and they get great recommendations, but especially with boards where you don't have a lot of really good criteria for what makes a good board member. I think it's just like what I said in the beginning, you're back calculating who was the best person for the job unconsciously based on like whoever you wanted to hire.
Yeah. And I'm generalizing here, but it's also clear that sometimes the person in the job isn't necessarily the best one anyway. Right? They're kind of good enough, right? I mean, this topic comes up a lot. Like, I used to lead talent and diversity development at a company before I started my own practice. We would talk a lot about how men are more willing to just raise their hand and say, "Hey, I'll figure it out when I get there." Yeah. Women are kind of like, I have to make sure that I get 100% on check off the boxes before I even apply. Right. And, and they would blame it on the actual applicant to say, "Oh, you need to be more courageous. You need to be more willing to just take a shot." But actually, it's the problem is that there's so many factors that come into play in terms of selection. And then we say, "Oh, we want the best person," but actually not always. You haven't always picked the best person, and you've found ways to get them in the system anyway.
Yeah, you probably have no criteria. And then, like,
yes,
what does best even mean? Is it like, I mentioned the SAT, is the person with the highest SAT scores, the most years of experience, like certain challenges or obstacles you want them to have overcome? I mean, it's all pretty arbitrary. Many hundreds of years ago, worked as a consultant, and we did selection systems to figure out, it was always for companies that had violated the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They've been sued. They were under consent decree to fix their selection systems to not be as racist. And it was in Texas too, where you are.
I'm not surprised.
And most of the time, I mean, some of them were just blatantly racist, but most of the time people believed in the selection systems that they were using. They're like, I'm hiring a truck driver and you have to be able to pass this like super high intelligence test. And that test had adverse impact and really has nothing to do with performance on the job, right?
Right.
And oftentimes it takes companies being sued and finding themselves under consent decree where someone's saying, you must change your selection procedures to really look at that. But here we go. We have the opportunity to be proactive now and really reconsider what we're calling, the best person for the job.
Yeah, and in your book, you talk about so it almost seems like some of the best intentioned leaders, even people that want to make a change, get in the way. So, again, people might even say, hey, I want diversity in the company, but I also believe in this meritocracy idea. And so you talked about these different archetypes of leaders and the myths or the folly of their approach. Two of them actually that stood out to me a lot, and I recommend to all the viewers here to really pick up this book. It's really enlightening. There was this idea that of the leader who's the optimist about DEI issues, and so they actually think that things are going to be great, but they actually get in the way of change. And the second one that really touched me was the culture Crusader, where they really are trying to create this kind of rah-rah team approach, but it does like get in the way of the uniqueness that people are trying to find. Can you share a little bit about what you found? What was anything surprising in terms of your research in terms of those archetypes?
Yeah, I think the culture Crusader to me was very surprising because we're talking about someone who's really good at building team spirit and making everyone feel like they belong, and maybe no one ever wants to quit their team, like that's their view, and everyone's like has to fit in. That's the way to build a really strong culture, is like to make everyone the same. That's what people think, at least. And if you're different to start with, then you don't necessarily fit in, and lots of people were willing to just do it, assimilate, and that caused them to be more likely to want to quit their job. But also, like, to me, the more interesting finding was it actually is hurting the team's productivity, because the whole benefit of having diversity, and beyond like social justice reason to do it, is that it brings in better decision making. You're less likely to just like go with the status quo or suffer from groupthink because you have different perspectives, right? But if everyone's just trying to fit in, like never say the different perspective, then you actually you don't get any of that benefit. So that's the point. So there's that one, culture Crusader. I thought was interesting.
And then the optimist one is just kind of putting the sugarcoating everything to say we're all going to get through this. Yeah,
and I think that's what we're seeing right now is so much optimism, right? Black Lives Matter. We all care. Our company is committed to this. Like the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, these will not, go on. We'll care about these things, and we're going to give money, and over time this will work itself out. And I mean, I think it's nice, I guess, to say good things and supportive of your workers, but then if you're just going to say nice things and then not do anything about it, then that's like really the optimist, is someone who's like, I care so much about diversity and I'm not going to do anything to make it happen. And for probably the largest categories of leaders that I interviewed, because I was mostly interviewing people who were like very effective or like really interested in diversity and inclusion. And I think they just weren't willing to take the next step of like, okay, what actually works is setting some goals, numeric goals, like figure out who you have, how many people, make sure that it's representation's equal all the way up and down the pipeline. And then once you know where you're short, where you're lacking, you go do intentional hiring, employee development, whatever it takes to fill those gaps. And that's what makes the difference, not the saying nice things and doing nothing about it.
Yeah, and I just had a recent conversation with a client where, we are taught to make sure that politics does not enter the workplace, and we, keep it professional. But obviously now, even the idea of whether you wear a mask or you don't wear a mask, or you care about reopening or not reopening, this is a political statement that you're making that maybe I don't even want to know what you think politically. But here's what's also interesting is if you don't say something, you're making a political statement now.
Right.
And so, what are your thoughts about, for leaders, this is particularly something that comes up a lot in my work, who are unsure of what to say? Does it come down to, again, like metrics and being more systematic about a change approach, or is there something else that you would say that recommend?
It's a good question. So I'll say maybe 4 years ago, after Alton Sterling and Philando Castile were killed. And there was, again, a Black Lives movement, but not as many companies actually spoke out, right, as we see today. And one company I actually tried to, or they wanted me to do some work with them on this issue. And no matter what, the CEO would not make a statement that Black Lives mattered, not even an internal statement to say, hey, to our Black employees and those of you in the Black community or who are affected by this issue, we're here to support you. We care, we recognize it. Instead, he would not mention it no matter what. He's like, if markets crashed in China, I would mention it because this is a finance company, but I'm not going to say anything about a political issue like Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And so that not saying anything at that time, I think it went relatively unnoticed, but today I think many more companies are stepping up and saying something. And then what do you say? So for my view, it's like, if you want to have authenticity, you got to look deeply and explain why Black Lives Matter in the context of your particular company, culture, strategy, values, whatever it is. Like, tie it to the heart of your organization, and then do something. do something about it.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to set a goal of increasing people of color in top management by 30% over the next 5 years, or like actually, and be transparent with your data. I think that's another huge thing you can do, is just saying like, you know, we're not there yet. And in order to increase accountability, we're going to put our numbers out there, and then everyone will know when we see.
That seems to be the biggest fear for companies, is to actually put it out there. You know, because then it's like, oh, we didn't hit it, so then we failed. But anything's a start. Stefanie, I wanted to actually ask you a couple of questions that came up from the audience here. My friend Darren actually has a pretty good question here. Dr. Johnson, what are some of your top recommendations to help executives overcome their own blind biases?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So obviously we all have these, and we're talking about it in the context of diversity, but we have lots of other blind spots, right? Or biases or behaviors that we're not aware of. So I think being like very intentional about feedback and getting people letting you know, what am I doing well? Like, what should I continue doing? What am I not doing enough of? And what do I need to do more of? And like, just making sure people always feel free to tell you those things. But the biggest thing that I found impacted leaders' unconscious biases was having empathy, talking to people in the organization who were different from them, learning their stories. And so that we don't have a ton of empathy for people who are different from us. There's even studies that show, like, if you're pricking people of color with needles, white people expect that they're feeling less pain than when you're pricking a white person. That is like, we don't have empathy. We're like, we think that other people don't experience pain in the same way we do. And that's super pervasive throughout the medical profession, where people of color often get underdosed with painkillers because of that perception that they feel less, right? It's crazy. So it's like starting to understand people will start to build that up. But then it's kind of like, to me, a two-pronged approach. So have empathy, talk to people, but like, that's not really enough. The other thing that really works is actually having diversity. So we see people who live in diverse communities, they're less biased, right? Because you start to see that Black people or women, like, it's not just one group. There's all sorts of different views and experiences and backgrounds within each of those groups. And when you have that like more individuated view of people, then you're less likely to just jump to the stereotypes and rely on the stereotypes.
Yeah, that is, first of all, that example you said about the pinprick is pretty fascinating, because I just think about so much of what we're realizing now is that people don't necessarily even know the value of a Black life.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that we can still find two sides to the issue when it comes to police brutality and those kinds of aspects. I think it comes down to, at the very core of it, we just don't even have that ability to feel empathy all the time for people apart from us.
It's so painful, right, to even face that thought.
Yes.
And I think that's why so many people like don't want to. They don't want to think about what that means for them, what that means for America. So they can't.
Yeah. Well, I know that we've actually reached the half-hour mark, and it's a shame because we've actually covered such deep ground here that I'd love to continue having. We had to have you back at some point, but I just want to kind of end with one question. If you just have a minute, this question came from Alana Vaughn Phillips, who says, "How can we remove stigma to be able to have better conversations around DE&I?"
Yeah, I mean that's so hard. Like for people of color, so I'll say for myself, right, as Mexican woman, talking about diversity is really easy. That, is a tailwind for me, because if you're not white, like if you're not part of the majority, you probably always talked about race. It's just like, probably, it's easy. But if you are white, it's really hard because of that fear. You want to be a good person. Who wants to be a racist, right? And you want to be on the right side of the aisle and all those things. So I feel like if it's just too hard to say, hey guys, I want to talk about race for the first time, then use some tools. Like I have tools on my website that's like a game kind of game. It's a lot less fun than it used to be, but to facilitate discussion around diversity and inclusion. Really, it's probably more focused on inclusion. That like you don't have to awkwardly bring it up for the first time, or hire an expert to come in and facilitate discussions so they can just like make it easier for everyone to speak, and then hopefully reserve judgment and make the goal of the conversation to learn, not to like one up each other or say why one group's worse than another, but just like to have greater empathy and understanding.
Yeah, to learn and not necessarily judge each other.
Exactly.
And I love your idea about bringing a facilitator too, because sometimes we don't want to ask for help, but there really are people that are better at this than we are, and actually know how to, and even just the idea of having a third party to kind of be balanced as we get out of our own biases, I think is really, really powerful.
I know. And if you think of it, if it were like strategy, so like I want to increase our online presence, you might very well bring in a consultant to give you advice on strategy. And I think DEI is part of strategy. And so you need to bring in some experts. Like this isn't something that most people are born knowing how to do. There's real skill and research and knowledge to be added. And so like bring in the outside expertise if you really care about it, I guess.
Yep. Yeah. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And also keep talking to folks like Stefanie, who just, I think, have the research and evidence-based background here that can take away some of the opinions that we keep throwing around in this polarized environment. So I really appreciate, your contribution and your voice in this work. So Stefanie, thank you so much for taking the time. For those of you that are interested in more of Stefanie's work, please what's your website, actually, if you want to just say it real quick?
Just like the name on the screen, it's drstephjohnson.com.
Perfect.
And if you want to know about the book, it's inclusifybook.com, or take the quiz to see if you're a culture crusader. It's inclusifyer.com, or if you want to hashtag Dr. Steph Johnson or hashtag inclusifybook.
Wonderful. And I highly recommend picking this book up. It's really fantastic and eye-opening. So thank you for joining us, Stefanie. Thank you to those of you that tune in today, and we'll wish you the rest of your day. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.
Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.